This is the second MP3 unit for the Genesis module of the field-based SPS. It was recorded by Wilrens Hoenstra on the 25th of February 2010. Its subject is type of literature, that is stories, and reading strategies for the book of Genesis. One thing of interest to know about me is that I am a biologist. My first degree was in biology. And we will look at some of the issues where Genesis and science meet, where they conflict or perhaps do not conflict. However, we will do this last, because it would be a mistake to come to the text expecting it to answer our questions. We first need to put these questions to the side and consider the original audience, their world, their concerns. They had very different questions. Evolution or the age of the earth were not among them. As we will see, two foundational principles of inductive Bible study are crucial in studying Genesis: the original audience and the type of literature. If we do not keep these two in mind, we are bound to misunderstand much of what we read in Genesis. Fact is, with this book and with the Old Testament, we enter a different world. It was different from our world in at least 4 respects. First, geography. It is not where we live. It is somewhere else. It is Israel. It is Mesopotamia, the land between the 2 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Some of it is in Egypt, but it is not where we live. It is a different world geographically. Second, it is a different world in language. The New Testament is written in Greek. Most of us do not know Greek, but at least it is an Indo-European language like the one you are listening to right now. The Old Testament is entirely written in Semitic languages, most of it Hebrew, plus a few passages written in Aramaic. So it is a different world in terms of language. Third, it is a different world in terms of time. All of this was a long time ago, much longer ago than the New Testament. The events referred to in the New Testament cover approximately 100 years. It was all written down in 50 years. The Old Testament was more like 1,000 years in the making. The story of the patriarchs in Genesis goes back several centuries more, to roughly 2100 BC. The first 11 chapters in the book take us back even further, beyond the threshold of history. Often they are described with a German word, Urzeit or Urgeschichte, prehistory. It may at first sight appear that we are still on firm historical ground, since Genesis gives us numbers and years, so we could construct a chronology. We could calculate the date for the beginning. We end up with something roughly 6,000 years ago. But the Earth certainly appears older than this, and it is generally accepted that this material is highly selective and incomplete. It covers more time than the rest of the Bible, yet it is so much shorter. So there is much that it leaves out, and it can therefore not be used for chronology or for establishing dates. The first 11 chapters contain a threshold that take us beyond human history. What we read here was already distant past when it was first written down. We should therefore not automatically assume that all of this is historical narrative in the fairly straightforward manner that we know from the rest of the Bible. Some of it may be something else, like symbolic stories, something to which I will return elsewhere. At any rate, all of it is a different world in terms of time. Then there's a fourth way in which this is a different world. I've said it is different geographically, in language, in time. It is also a different world in terms of concepts, worldview, how people think. The way they saw the world and the way they thought about the world is so different from our day and age. And this too we will have to consider at different places in studying the book. But now, stories. First, something more general on stories. We have a tendency to think of stories that they are simple, perhaps even stories are something for children. Stories can be simple, but they are often also profound, and stories are definitely not just for children. One definition of human beings is that humans are storytelling animals. People everywhere tell stories. It is one of the things that sets us apart from animals. Even in modern Western society, where people do not sit in circles to listen to a storyteller, the way this was done in the past, there is still a lot of storytelling going on. Think of movies, computer games, the evening news. What do we watch when we switch on TV? It is very much part of human nature to tell stories about ourselves, about others, about God and the world. Interestingly and fittingly, therefore, the Bible is a storybook. There is a lot of material in the Bible which belongs in this category. It is the type of literature that is used most in Scripture. The Bible rarely gives us propositional truth. There is not much theoretical discussion of things. Much of the truth that it presents is wrapped up in the form of stories. Often, stories of the Bible are not as easy and simple as they appear. For instance, they tell us what happened, but they do not necessarily tell us what to think of this. Was it good? Was it bad? Well, sometimes they do. They give us a clear judgment on the things that happen in the story, but at other times they do not. This includes some rather shocking stories, like the one on Judah and Tamar in chapter 38. No comment. There are people who have more than one wife in Genesis. No comment. We are told this without judgment or evaluation. It should be very clear to us, therefore, that just because something is in the Bible does not mean it is a good thing. And it is not always immediately clear what is good, what is bad, what is neutral. Now, we have a tendency to use these stories for information. We treat the Bible as an encyclopedia or compendium. We just have to rearrange the material to know what the Bible says about X, Y, Z. Or we approach a story and want to squeeze out a principle or a truth. And of course, there's a point to this. It's often possible to derive a principle from a story. However, when we do this, we reduce the text. We do lose something. We may even end up destroying the text, much like, and now comes the biologist, dissecting an animal. Slowly, part by part, we take it apart, all the different organs. Oh, I had to do this during my studies. At the end, what do you have left? Well, certainly not an animal. At the end of dissecting and analyzing stories, what do we have left? Well, principles perhaps, but the story has disappeared. I do not want to imply that it is wrong to look for principles, but often it is not really the way stories work and the way they speak to us. They tend to work differently. We enter into the story. We identify with one or more of the people involved. And then, as we are living this story in our imagination, we discover parallels to our own lives. There's something in this story that fits our life or situation. For instance, I read how God tells Abraham to leave his country and his family to go to a land that God will show him. This functions as an example or a model or a paradigm for us. We too have to leave behind, trust God and his destiny for us. Now, this story speaks to us regardless of whether God is asking us to physically move somewhere or not. Later in Genesis, God points Abraham to the stars to show him how many his descendants will be. This is God's promise to Abraham. In my case, the promise may be a different one, but the story still encourages me that God will do what he has promised. Again, Abraham's experience becomes a model for me. Abraham says, God, your reward will be very great. If I'm faithful, perhaps my reward will be great as well. And then think of the story in chapter 24, where Abraham sends his servant to go find a wife for his son Isaac. Now I am married. I do not have to go and find a wife. And I won't go and find a wife for someone else. This is not what we do in our culture. So what about this story? Well, I can still see how Abraham's servant trusts God, and in a different enterprise I can do the same thing. And I see how God guides him very unspectacularly, but God is there, and the servant ends up just at the right place at the right time. It is encouraging, and it may well speak to me in a very different setting. Now we come to the whole story of Jacob, of how God deals with him. Now look at that. This man is a cheater. That is what his name means, and it describes what he does. He cheats his brother, and he cheats his father. And Jacob is not exactly a nice guy. I would not want to buy a used car of him. But God still chooses Jacob and begins to work in his life. The cheater gets cheated. We find out that there's an even bigger cheater than Jacob, his relative Laban. And as Jacob gets cheated, first by Laban and then by his own sons in the disappearance of Joseph, God is at work in his life. He gradually transforms him through life's experiences. One critical crisis situation is particularly used by God. When Jacob returns to Canaan and Esau is on his way to meet him, Jacob reaches the end of his resources. He does not know anymore what to do. This is when a man comes and wrestles with Jacob through the night, and somehow we realize that this must be God. And through this encounter, God changes his identity. Jacob becomes Israel. But it is not the end of it yet. Coming back to the land, Jacob settles at Shechem. He even buys a plot of land there, so he obviously intends to stay. But that was not the deal that he had made with God at Bethel before he left the land of Canaan. The deal was God would bless him and look after him and provide for him, and then Jacob would set up an altar at Bethel. So why does Jacob not move on to Bethel as he had promised? Well, we see in the story that God allows trouble to develop. It gets Jacob moving again. And at this point, we get to see what has been holding him back. He tells his family to put away the foreign gods that are among them. So apparently, Jacob realized full well that to go to Bethel and appear before God, he had to leave certain things behind. Interestingly, It is only after this, when Jacob arrives in Bethel, that God appears to him and reconfirms the promise. This had not happened at Shechem. God had not appeared to him there. It is only when Jacob, or Israel, arrives in Bethel that God appears to him again. By the end of these stories about Jacob, we see how God has changed or transformed a human being. God works with people who are not perfect. He takes a rough diamond, and each of us is a rough diamond, and cuts it and polishes it until it becomes a fine jewel ready to shine. There's much in this Jacob story that can speak into my life without me ever formulating or distilling a principle from it, although in principle I could do that as well. Then we have the Joseph narrative. It is a relatively long block of material that tells an ongoing story. First, there is the dream. As I enter into the story, I may see a parallel with my own life regarding something God promised to me or some dream that I have. We get to see Joseph's secret. How did he end up being so successful in Egypt? It was not something he did. It was something God did. A number of times it states in the text that God was with him, that God blessed him. In the end, everything turns out for good. Now that is encouraging. And we begin to suspect that it is not Joseph, but God who is the main character in this book, in this story. We also have the story of Potiphar's wife in there. Look at Joseph's commitment to do what is right and to abstain from what is wrong. Look at the contrast with Judah in chapter 38, right before this story. Judah and Tamar make Joseph stand out all the more among his brothers. Take the story of the fall in Genesis 3. One thing we have here is profound psychological insight. Adam's defense to God is, "The woman you gave me." Well, that's blame shifting and dodging responsibility. Isn't that a typical human response that we've all shown at one time or another? This is how these stories enable us to look at our own lives, to recognize things about ourselves, and to learn things about God. We get a chance to step into other people's shoes and benefit from their relationship with God.